which is basically what we can and can't do. It's our how-to rules of general operating and flight rules. We call them usually the how-tos of what we can or cannot do when we're operating a drone. Going into this, we have the first one, which is going to be the UAS registration. So anytime we have a drone that is weighing greater than 0.55 pounds, a little over half a pound, and less than 55 pounds operating under Part 107, it needs to be registered with the FAA prior to actually operating within the National Airspace System. In order to register a drone, you have to be at least 13 years of age in order to do so. And they make it very easy. There's a website, there's a page on the FAA website that allows you to register the drone. And you keep in mind that if you are operating or an SUAS operation requires a foreign aircraft permit, if you've already registered in a foreign country, it's owned, controlled, or operated by someone who is not a U.S. citizen. Prior to operations, your SUAS must have a unique identification number, which is typically provided by the FAA during the registration process. So it's going to be on the form or the document that they give you, and then the number has to be visible or accessible. Okay, so just keep in mind, if you happen to be a foreign national, or if you have a drone that is already registered in somewhere outside the United States or a foreign country to the United States, you will need this foreign aircraft permit. If you have a brand new drone and you're registering it to the United States, just to be 13 years of age or older, and the drone needs to weigh greater than greater than 0.55 pounds and less than 55 pounds operating under Part 107. And then that sticker or that ID number needs to be on there and visible or accessible. Sometimes people put it in the battery compartment and just tape it in. And that's the only thing you guys need to worry about. At any point in time, pretty much for any FAA license that you hold, there is the potential that you could get what we call a ramp check. And this could be done by any of the following. So it could be a representative from the FAA, like a safety inspector, could be someone from the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, the TSA, or any federal, state, or local law enforcement officer has the ability to request your basic documents, okay? So the documents, and this is also a new change in this evolution as well. So the new change that kind of came out was, in the past, you only needed to have your UAS or UAV license, remote pilot license, accessible, and then any waiver or exemption that you needed. Now it's more in line with the rest of the FAA requirements with pilots. So you are required to have in your possession or readily accessible a valid government issued ID. You will need your pilot certificate, which will be your remote pilot certificate, that blue card in the lower right, aircraft registration, and then also any waivers or exemptions. So if you needed to get a waiver for whatever mission or whatever your objective was for today, you need to have that documentation in hand in the event that you are requested to present that information. Okay. If your drone was purchased secondhand, then yep, you would just re-register it, and you can go on the FAA website to do it. For some of those other questions that I see, I will answer those probably before the break because they're a little bit off topic, but I'll be happy to answer them as well. All right, going back to our VOs, visual observers. So a visual observer is a person that basically is a crew member. They're a required crew member in some aspects, okay? So they are there as your second set of eyes, and they are basically in an operational or flight crew capacity, meaning that if they are required for whatever you're doing, they have to meet the requirements in terms of the drug and alcohol requirements that we discussed previously. And then remember that if you want to use a VO, it's up to you. It's your prerogative if you want to do so or not. It's completely optional. If you do it, the remote PIC, the remote pilot in command, has to ensure that all visual observers are going to be positioned in a location where they can see the SUAS continuously and sufficiently to maintain visual line of sight. They're basically acting as your extended eyes. They need to possess a means of effective communication with effectively communicate the SUAS position and the position of other aircraft to the remote pilot in command or person manipulating the controls. So typically, for the most part, the easiest and most efficient way would just be like a radio system. I've seen other folks basically just have their cell phone and basically call each other and leave it as an open line, and they'll usually wear like what are they called, ear pods or whatever they are, where you can talk hands-free and do it that way. Now, the main thing is also to coordinate. So you want to scan the airspace where this drone is going to be operating for any potential collision hazards, and then maintain awareness of the position of the SUAS through direct observation. That's basically what they're doing. Prior to actually getting in the air, you'll usually have a little meeting, a pre-flight meeting, where you'll remind them what their obligations are, where you want them to stand, what are the hazards, what's the weather. You're going to basically brief them on the conditions of the flight, whatever your objectives of the flight are, and any potential hazards, and what in the event that something bad happens, like the drone decides to not act or basically follow the commands of the PIC. Maybe it's a dead battery or some part that got broken. What are your kind of emergency or backup procedures? You want to communicate all that before you actually get the drone in the air. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at these FAA test questions here. During an SUAS operation, whose sole task is it to watch the SUAS and report potential hazards to the rest of the crew? Is it A, remote pilot in command, B, person manipulating the controls, or C, visual observer? Correct answer, the C's have it. So good job, everyone. It is going to be the visual observer. All right, moving on. We're going to talk a little bit about carrying hazardous materials. These should be obvious, but we don't want to carry hazardous materials. It's not going to be conducive to our health, nor is it safe for drone operation. So hazardous materials are defined as any substance or material that is capable of posing an unreasonable risk to health, safety, and property when transported commercially. This does include hazardous wastes, marine pollutants, elevated temperature materials, and other materials meeting the definitions of hazardous substances. Keep in mind that the FAA, for this purposes, most lithium batteries would normally fall under this. If they're installed within the device, then they're actually not considered part of the hazardous materials under the Part 107. Okay, so your batteries are good to go as long as they are physically installed in the device, whether they are temporary or a permanent installation. All right, going to our daylight operations 107.29 here. So Part 107, remember, as of, basically as of tomorrow is when the regulations officially become live. So typically in the past, you could only fly your drone during daylight hours. Okay, so now with the new training, as long as you've taken your FAA written exam after March 1st, so you guys would be good as long as you take it after this course. Or if you are currently a licensed remote pilot and you'd have to go on the FAA safety and basically take the new updated training, which was live on March 1st, then you guys can actually operate during nighttime hours. Now, the other thing that we need to know is, how does the FAA define nighttime hours? Okay, and we basically use this thing called the Air Almanac. And it's a book that basically provides the information on sunrise to sunset, the official times, and it comes out every year. You don't need to physically have this book. If you just Google sunrise, sunset, it's the same times that you're going to find online. And the portion here that we have is, we also have something called evening civil twilight, and also the beginning of morning civil twilight. So anytime that we're talking about nights, we are talking about the time between the end of evening civil twilight and the beginning of morning civil twilight. Okay, so that's what we mean. So evening civil twilight is the period from sunset until 30 minutes after sunset, and morning civil twilight is the period of 30 minutes before sunrise until sunrise. So, for example, let's assume we have recorded sunset at a time of 6 p.m. local. Okay, well, you would have 30 minutes after that, which is basically your evening civil twilight, which would take you to 6:30 p.m. And then at this point, everything after 6:30 would be considered nighttime. The reason why they give you this buffer here is that at 6 p.m. the sun is officially going to set, but as you know, even after the sun sets, there's still some light in the atmosphere that's reflecting, and it's not pitch dark, okay? Same thing goes if we knew that sunrise was at 5:30 a.m., then basically at 5 a.m. would basically be evening. So from 6:30 p.m. to 5 a.m. in my example would basically be nighttime hours, okay? There is a test question on that in terms of evening, civil, twilight, or when do they actually consider nighttime. So nighttime is 30 minutes after sunset or 30 minutes before sunrise, okay? All right, 10729, operations at night. So like I said before, this is your new ability at this point. So as a remote pilot in command, you can actually conduct night operations now, or actually starting in a day or two here. And the only thing you need to do is you need to update your initial test or take the recurrent online training before conducting any operations. Prior to this, nighttime operations were not allowed, and you actually had to get a waiver. So if you have a waiver previously to when this regulation came out, then, and keep in mind, it comes out officially in 2 days, then your waiver is still good until May 17th of 2021. So there is still some overlap there. So the reason why there is overlap, though, is that these folks who have a waiver, they are required to actually get their recurrent training done before May 17th. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to exercise their privileges for night operations until they get their new recurrent training done online. So anytime that we're operating at night, the small unmanned aircraft must be equipped with an anti-collision light, which is basically just like a flashing light that's typically going to be red. And that light has to have the ability to be seen for at least 3 statute miles and have a flash rate sufficient to avoid a collision. The anti-collision lights have to be operational. So if you're doing your pre-flight and you're realizing the light is not coming on or it's not working, then that is a no-go. Surprisingly, though, you can actually get a waiver in the event that you don't have an anti-collision light, but that all needs to be planned ahead of time prior to going out. All right, next one is going to be visual line of sight. So this is the VLOS. We've talked about this a few times. Anytime that you're flying your drone, you have to basically maintain your visual line of sight by using the flight crew members at any and all times that you're flying. So visual line of sight means that any flight crew member, and keep in mind that does include yourself, the PIC, or the visual observer, is capable of seeing the aircraft with the unaided eye, other than corrective lenses and such as binoculars. So we're not using our space telescope to see and saying, yep, I've got visual line of sight, or, using some high powered binoculars and it's basically whatever your uncorrected vision is, minus any glasses, of course, or contact lenses. As long as you can see the drone, then you're good to go. It also allows the remote PIC to lose sight for brief periods for operational necessity. So that doesn't mean flying behind a building, but let's assume that you are inspecting a cell phone tower or something like that, and you go slightly, it goes out of sight for a second. If it's maybe a pole or something along those lines, that's perfectly acceptable. But that doesn't mean you can fly behind a building or anything large like that for extended periods of time. It is your job as a remote PIC to ensure that you are completing a pre-flight. We will talk more about pre-flight on the 28th and what that actually entails, etc. But for right now, just realize that you need to do a pre-flight. So before you actually operate the drone in any capacity, you want to basically check it over and you want to familiarize yourself with whatever manufacturer that made your drone. A lot of them will actually have a checklist that you can print out and things that you'll want to check ahead of time. So what you're effectively doing is inspecting it. You're making sure that there's nothing broken, that all the components are there, the batteries are charged, replacing anything that is potentially broken. But in addition to that, besides just checking the device, right, you also have other responsibilities as well. So your job prior to the flight is to basically assess the operating environment in which it's going to be operating in. So that includes weather conditions, airspace, flight restrictions, and then you also need to be aware of any locations of any type of persons or property that may be affected. You have to inform your crew members, if you have any, about the operation, their roles, including the operating conditions, emergency procedures, contingency procedures, and then any other roles and responsibilities. You want to inspect the device to see if it's in a condition for safe operation. And then it's also your job to maintain all of the documentation required in the event that you have an on-site FAA inspection. Okay. All right, a couple other operating limitations that we're going to be talking about. They're split into the drone themselves, and then we have the crew member operating limitations. So the first one is the SUAS operating limitations, which is the drone cannot be flown faster than a ground speed. And these are test questions of either 87 knots or 100 miles per hour. The SUAS cannot be flown higher than 400 feet AGL. So that means AGL just stands for above ground level, unless flown within a 400-foot radius of a structure and not flown higher than 400 feet above the structure's immediate uppermost limit. So assuming that maybe you're doing a cell phone inspection or a tower inspection, something along those lines, you may have your hill, and you might have your, this is my version of drawing here, everybody. You might have your cell phone antenna tower, and the very, very top of that tower happens to be, let's call it 800 feet high. Okay, so it's a tall tower. Now, if we were not inspecting that, our normal limitation for our drone flying is going to be 400 feet AGL. So that's basically just 400 feet above ground level. Okay. If we're going to be inspecting this device, we can actually go 400 feet above it. Okay. So we could actually go up to, so if this is 800 feet tall, then our max altitude will be 1200 feet AGL. That's really the only time that we can go above that rule. Okay. So the normal thing is going to be 400 feet, and then we can go 400 feet above something that we were inspecting. So like I said, 400-foot radius within the structure and not flown higher than 400 feet above the structure's immediate uppermost limit. Okay, so you have a pretty small area in which you can operate. You can't go a half a mile away from that cell phone tower and go up to 1200 feet in that example. It's going to basically bypass this 400-foot radius that we had there. All right, crew member operating limitations. You have a minimum visibility as observed from the location of the control station. You need to have at least 3 statute miles of visibility or standard miles visibility. And then you have a minimum distance from clouds, which must be no less than 500 feet below a cloud and 2,000 feet horizontally from a cloud. Okay, so pretty simply, you've got 3 statute miles of visibility. You can be 500 feet below a cloud, and then you need to be about 2,000 feet horizontally from a cloud. You'll notice that we don't talk about being above a cloud because that means that you are outside the visual line of sight. Okay. A lot of people ask, how do you figure out what 500 feet is or 2,000 feet? It is best guess in your opinion. Obviously, if the FAA was there, if you think it was 2,000 feet, usually what we tell students on check rides and stuff is your 2,000 feet and the examiner's 2,000 feet are probably not equal. Okay, so give yourself a wider buffer in these cases. Okay, but it's going to be up to you to determine what 500 feet below a cloud is and 2,000 feet horizontally from a cloud is as well. All right. All right, let's do a FAA test question here. And then we'll take that break and then we'll wrap up everything here. All right, so unless otherwise authorized, what is the maximum airspeed at which a pilot may operate a SUAS below 400 feet? Is it 200 knots, 80 miles per hour, or 100 miles per hour? So we've got about 96% of the class with the correct answer. Correct answer is going to be C, which is 100 miles an hour. So remember, it's going to be 87 knots or 100 miles per hour is going to be the limit. Once again, this is your limitation unless you request a waiver directly from the FAA in those cases, okay? All right, so let's do this. Let's take a 5-minute break, stretch your legs, grab something to drink, and we'll finish it up. I think we could probably do it in about 30 or 35 minutes with the last bit, and then I will open it up to any questions that you guys and gals may have, all right? So I'll see everybody in 5. All right, so continuing on with our general operating rules section, we're going to go on to 107.43, which is operations around airports. So keep in mind that you cannot operate your drone in any manner that interferes with operations and traffic patterns at any airport, heliport, or seaplane base. Okay, you've probably read about news reports in the media. There was one here in Los Angeles where someone was operating a drone, and then there was a jetpack operating somewhere near Los Angeles International as well. So all of these things can get you in trouble pretty quickly, and you basically just want to avoid it. Okay, so you don't want to fly within the flight path or of an oncoming aircraft. They basically have the right of way over you. Okay, so we'll talk about right of way rules here just actually now. All right, so your right of way rules, just like when you drive a car, right? So we usually have, if you're at a 4-way stop, person on your right typically will have the right of way, assuming people follow the rules. Hard to say that here in Los Angeles, but as the remote piloting command, you have to yield the right of way to all other aircraft, manned or unmanned, and avoid potential hazards. Basically, see and avoid. That's the big thing. And you also cannot operate the SUAS so close to another aircraft as to create a collision hazard. So these are your responsibilities. You need to know the location and flight path of your drone. It's good and wise to kind of plot that out and figure out what is your game plan rather than kind of getting in the air and then figuring out what you want to do from there. Be aware of any aircraft person's property within the vicinity of your operating area. Kind of make a mental note of it or write it down. Let your other crew know as well. And then also, be able to maneuver the drone to avoid a collision, prevent other aircraft from having to take evasive actions, and then also avoid approach corridors, taxiways, and helipads. All right. So just kind of stay out of the way of everybody else effectively. 107.52 and 107.53 deal with transponders and ADS-B. So this is also kind of new stuff as well. So most drones that you're going to be buying online are not going to have any type of transponder or ADS-B. And if it did have one, you're not supposed to use it. Okay, so you cannot operate any SUAS with a transponder on, nor can you operate an SUAS with ADS-B out equipment in transmit mode. Typically, these are going to be found in these $1 million drones like the Predators and those types that the military have, and effectively a transponder and ADS-B do the exact same thing. So they give a position report of where that aircraft is at any given time, including altitude, and the ADS-B stuff also updates far more regularly, and it will also give the call sign number. Shouldn't be an issue for anybody here, unless you're spending $100,000 on a drone. It's probably not going to have a transponder or ADS-B. But we do have to just mention it because it is in the regulations. Okay. We already did that, guys. All right, so going to operations from moving vehicles, 107.25. So you can actually operate an SUAS from a moving land or water vehicle as long as it's over what is known as sparsely populated areas. Okay, so sparsely populated areas would basically not be your urban environments, but just think of a rural environment, whether you're going into farmland or it's just not a high density area where we've got a lot of people in a given location, whether it's homes or commercial buildings. Sparsely populated just means sparsely populated. The population is pretty much low or minimal. Okay, you can do that, and if it's not transporting another person's property for compensation or hire. So if you are, this is going to kind of fall in the lines of what we would talk about in the future with drones, where Amazon is going to be, effectively delivering your products from the air. That's, I think, their end goal here. In this regard, if they're basically delivering, let's say, my milk to my house, and they're using a vehicle like you see in this example, then they can't do it because it's my property and they're getting paid to do so. All right. You cannot operate from a moving aircraft, so you can't actually use one aircraft to control your drone as well. It's got to be a different, it cannot be from an aircraft, okay? So you can do basically vehicles or boats. All right, subpart D, this was formerly known as waivers, and this is the new regulation that came out. So this is operations over human beings. And this is basically going to tell you the eligibility and operating requirements to operate over people or moving vehicles. Now, the new things that we're going to kind of be talking about are going to be these new categories. There's category 1 through 4, depending on the type of drone and how it's actually equipped. And keep in mind that the images that I used in this slide presentation will not necessarily reflect the category level, all right? Because this stuff just came out, and this is basically the final rule, there is no exhaustive list that tells me what drones fall under which one of these categories, okay? So you'll notice at the end of the day, most of the drones that we have that are already on the market are probably not going to be in compliance with these regulations. So that's also important to note. As time goes on, then we will probably get a more exhaustive list in terms of the current drones on the market, different modifications that can be made to the drones. One of the big things that you're going to see in most of these is this statement right here, which says that the drone cannot contain any exposed rotating parts that would lacerate human skin. As you can see, that is an exposed rotating part. Majority of drones out there that have already been manufactured are basically designed like that. They don't have a guard around them. So there are probably going to be ways in the near future where there will be either manufacturer kits or third-party companies that will allow you to modify your drone so that way you can meet one of these eligibility levels. All right. So keep in mind that this is kind of a flexible term. So as we move forward, so the category 1 is going to be an SUAS that weighs less than 0.55 pounds, including everything on board or otherwise attached. Usually going to be a fairly small drone. Cannot contain any exposed rotating parts that would lacerate the human skin. And there is no FAA means or accepted means of compliance or declaration of compliance is required. Category 2 is going to be just a little bit larger. So this is going to be where we're dealing with different severity of injury. So you're going to notice that we're going to change the terminology a little bit here. So the SUAS must not cause injury to a human being that is equivalent or greater than the severity of injury caused by a transfer of 11 foot-pounds of kinetic energy upon impact from a rigid object. I'm not a doctor. I cannot tell you what 11 foot-pounds of energy would do to the human body. So once again, eventually I would assume that the FAA would come out with a list telling you the make and model of your drone and what would be the category that would fit under. Once again, we'll see that it cannot contain any exposed rotating parts that could lacerate human skin. So basically most of the DJIs that are on the market right now, they're going to need some type of modification because all of the rotor blades are typically going to be exposed. The SUAS cannot contain any safety defects, and then it requires FAA accepted means of compliance and an accepted declaration of compliance, which is basically a document saying that it meets the eligibility requirements, and it's something that we could then submit to the FAA. Category 3, we're getting into something a little bit larger, and with this type of SUAS, it cannot cause injury to a human being that is equivalent to or greater than the severity of injury caused by the transfer of 25 foot-pounds of kinetic energy upon impact from the rigid object. Once again, same requirement, cannot contain any exposed rotating parts that could lacerate human skin upon impact, cannot contain any safety defects, and in this case as well, we have to have some type of accepted declaration of compliance or means of compliance to make sure that we are actually complying with everything that this regulation states, that it's no more than 25 foot-pounds of kinetic energy, that we have no exposed parts, and that it does not contain any safety defects. That's what we're basically trying to comply with as we look at it, right? The next one, when I saw this image, I had to put it on there. I thought this was a flying barbecue, but I guess looking at it in further detail, this is what we're talking about with the new Amazon delivery drones with their little box on there. So if you fall under category 4, these are going to be probably the most expensive professional drones out there. These drones are actually certified by the FAA under Part 21, and they're going to have something known as an airworthiness certificate, which is the exact same thing that every airplane is issued as well. So it has to go through an extensive testing process. The manufacturer works with the FAA, and then eventually it gets approved once it meets the FAA criteria. So the SUAS must be operated in accordance with the operating limitations specified in the approved flight manual or as otherwise specified by the administrator. So one of the big differences is if you pick up your local drone, whether it's a $5 drone or you pick up the $1,000 DJI drone that's on the market, when you get the manufacturer model, there's not a lot of information in there. It'll tell you a little bit about a pre-flight and some other things. When you look at these types of drones, it will give you max altitudes, max temperatures, minimum temperatures, density altitudes. It will give you a wide variety of information in terms of the limitations for that drone. And whatever the limitations that were printed in that flight manual, you have to comply with. All right. Once again, the operating limitations must not prohibit operations over human beings. Everything that we've talked about, I know that we've been talking about this for a while, is really related to the operations over human beings. You have to figure out which category you're in first. So that's the reason why we're defining the categories. And then finally, the SUAS must have maintenance, preventative maintenance, alterations, or inspections performed in accordance with specific requirements in the final rule. So typically the manufacturer will come out and let you know how often maintenance needs to occur, any preventative maintenance, different checklists, and those types of things, which is you're typically not going to find in the smaller drones that are out there. Okay. The other rule that we also want to talk about in this section is going to be FAR 89. This is a brand new regulation that came out. And we're going to talk about it just briefly here, but keep in mind what I basically underlined and bolded there was that the rule, even though that the rule is out right now, it does not take effect until 30 months after the effective date of the rule. Okay, so this is known as Remote ID, and Part 89 of the FAR is actually a new section in the regulations. And Remote ID is basically going to provide information about different drones in flight, such as their identity, location, altitude, and its control station or takeoff location. Now, authorized individuals from public safety organizations, police departments, FAA, FBI, whoever it is, they actually can request this information and track down your information should you potentially be operating somewhere where you shouldn't. Okay, nowadays it's a lot harder to do that, because you'd actually have to see where the drone landed and then track down whoever was operating that drone. Now, there's 3 different ways that pilots will actually be able to meet these ID rules. And like I said, you've got plenty of time, almost 2 years here to do this. And the 3 different ways are going to be the following. So number 1, I'll start with basically from left to right here. So we've got our standard way, which is a drone is going to broadcast the remote ID. And that's basically could be done via Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or a radio frequency. And then that will then be transmitted via your cell phone or whatever you have to the appropriate location. So from takeoff to shutdown, it will basically identify all these different things: the drone ID, location, altitude, velocity, time, emergency status, etc. Okay. Then we have drones with remote ID broadcast modules. So as manufacturers are now absorbing this new rule, they will probably start to build in the capability of the broadcast function where we're not necessarily doing it through our phones. Okay, so this is once again another capability. And then finally, we have this new area called the FAA Recognized Identification Area, the FRIA. And if you're operating within this specific area, you can actually operate without remote ID. Okay, so it's a very specific area. They'll give you a radius of a location and up to an altitude, and really anybody can fly there. But just keep that in mind. This is coming later down the road. And the reason why they're giving it so much time is everybody has to kind of catch up to the remote ID, make sure that you're actually following the regulations and getting everything equipped. All right, so now that we know what remote ID is, and now that we know what these categories are, let's see how they actually apply if you're going to be flying over people. So if you have a category 1 or category 2 drone, then you are actually prohibited from operating the drone in sustained flight over open air assemblies unless you comply with the FAA Remote ID rule. Okay, so if you want to do that in a category 1 or category 2, you have to make sure that your drone is equipped with remote ID. If you are operating in a category 3 aircraft, or drone in this case, then the pilots must not operate the small unmanned aircraft over open air assemblies of human beings. Pilots may only operate the drone above any human being if the operation meets one of the following conditions. So the first one here is the operation is within or over a closed or restricted access site, and everybody is located within the closed or restricted access site must be on notice that a small unmanned aircraft may be flying over them. So what we mean by closed access site is you're basically closing it off to the public, and those that are within that area where you will be conducting your drone operations, they are aware of the potential hazards and they are knowingly in the way. So if maybe you're a film crew and you're doing some filming, you know, on a set or something like that, then all the actors would then be aware of the situation of the drone, where that camera is supposed to be in the event that the drone or some type of emergency happens. And then obviously nobody outside of what is actually happening on that set is going to be allowed within that space. That's what we mean by closed or restricted access site. The other one that we have for the other condition is that the SUAS does not maintain sustained flight over any human being unless that human being is directly participating in the operation of the small unmanned aircraft or located under a covered structure or inside a stationary vehicle that can provide reasonable protection from a falling small unmanned aircraft. Okay, like a concert venue. That's a good one, Dale. All right, and then finally, our category 4 are supersized ones here. They have to have an airworthiness certificate issued under Part 21. They have to be operated in accordance with the operating limitations from the approved flight manual. And then the operating limitations, the key here is that the manufacturer, whatever they put inside your flight manual is what you have to abide by. So you want to make sure that it does not prohibit operations over humans. That's the main thing. So if it does, then unfortunately your category 4 is you can't fly over people at that point. You have to have maintenance, preventative maintenance, alterations, inspections performed in accordance with specific maintenance requirements detailed in the final rule. And you have to meet the requirements of standard remote identification or remote identification broadcast modules. Basically, you just need to meet the remote ID requirements. Okay. All right, and then the final section that we want to talk about, or the final thing within this section, is going to be operations over moving vehicles. So we talked about over people. Now you can actually fly over moving vehicles, which is a new one as well. So if you have a category 1, 2, or 3, it must be eligible to operate over people. You may not maintain sustained flight over moving vehicles, but you can transit operations. So if you have a moving vehicle and let's say you're trying to get maybe a shot of it for a film or commercial, you cannot fly directly over it for extended periods of time, but you can basically transit from left to right or however you want to do it, as long as it's not directly overflying the vehicle for any given period of time. If you're operating under Cat 1, 2, or 3, the small unmanned aircraft throughout the operation must have the following. Basically, there's 2 requirements here. We must remain within or over a closed or restricted access site, and all humans must be located inside a moving vehicle within the closed or restricted access site. Must be on notice that the SUAV or SUAS can or may fly over them. Okay, so basically people who are participating need to know where that there is a potential for hazard, that you are operating under a closed or restricted access site, and that the people that you're going to be flying over, the human beings, are going to be actually protected by that vehicle. The second criteria or component here is that they must not maintain sustained flight over moving vehicles. So once again, you can transit from left to right, right to left, up to down, however you want to do it. You just can't fly over it for extended periods. And then finally, if you are the category 4, then you need to have, once again, airworthiness certificate. It needs to be operated within the operating limitations of whatever the manufacturer specified. And then your operating limitations must not prohibit operations, basically the same thing, over human beings located in moving vehicles. Okay. Yeah, so drag strips, concert venues, any of those would be restricted locations, and you'd obviously have to notify all parties involved.